So we are continuing forward with part 5, and last time we saw how is it that the analyst develops a sort of metaphorical space through which an analysand is able to construe how is it that they desire by generally asking the question, what do you want from me? When we desire in accordance to some anonymous social, the big other. We utilize language as a way of constraining our desire, but that's already taking on some notion of language that will, in one way or another, affect how we desire. Or in analysis, we may be wondering what the desire of the analyst is, such that when we are narrating our life to them, it construes desire in such a way that it is modelized, modified by the presence of the analyst, and has it that in part we can construe desire as in functions in relationship to another. But this also comes with excesses of what desire cannot apprehend. When we are trying to desire in accordance to the other, whether that's the analyst or some religious figure or language or some political ideology, there's always some excess to desire that cannot be comprehended by this space. That, for example, when I'm working myself through the analyst, there's always some remnant, some excess aspect of desire that stays with me after analysis. So after a poem or after a theatric play or after a religious ceremony, all these things that one is trying to work oneself through, one finds that there's always some excess left over from the experience. So for those who are following the playlist that I have set up for this introduction to Lacan, I have put in it two clips from the 2005 documentary on Zizek. And I think these particular clips are pretty important to talk about in respect to this. Žižek does differ from Lacan in various aspects, and I think it would be pretty important to look at his own work in respect to how he appropriates Lacan and whatnot. In this particular aspects that I wanted to highlight from the movie, I want to focus particularly on how I said that Žižek performs a role akin to the one we've been discussing. How I said that Žižek is this other through which people are trying to work himself through. In the first clip, we can find Žižek being in Buenos Aires, having a presentation for a variety of different students. Oh, was it Buenos Aires? I think it might have been New York. Anyways, the point being is that when he's around any one room, he starts being essentially being the chatter of the room, the person that everyone's coming here to see him. But interestingly enough, when he's talking about political ideology and about how to construe the use of psychoanalysis to understand that he is not the person that will tell us what we want out of a political situation, and that part of it depends on us to be able to overcome Žižek in a sense, as just we are lingering waiting for an answer over how to deal with present circumstances. When we're dealing with Žižek as this other, one has a lot of expectations and anticipations that he will give us the answer, the formula of how to fix the given political situation, which seems to be something that Žižek is pretty wary of. For one, he gets asked a question of how he can account for his popularity, which is curious, as he mentions that his popularity is almost a way of not treating him seriously. And we can see a little bit of this in earlier parts of the film that I didn't include. For instance, when he's in an interview with a newscaster who evidently and admittedly doesn't understand Lacan and doesn't really understand Žižek. So the way in which he presented him to a broader audience was just through the general notion of, I had no idea what this guy is about, but he's eccentric, so let's have him on. So Žižek's popularity, at least at that point in time, seemed to be something that in some respect worked against some of his more political intentions. That the intention for Žižek wasn't so much just telling us how said that the political ideology plays this sort of role of the big other, and that with the big other there are excesses to it, as in the case of capitalism with surplus value and surplus enjoyment. But more importantly too, the second clip of the film, which is leading towards the end, features essentially how Žižek is not this pure other that we envision when we are asking ourselves, what do you want from me? So, in this respect, when we are putting all these anticipations and expectations into the mythologized figure of Žižek, we are also disabling ourselves from being able to step out of analysis, a step out of ideology in a sense, to kind of figure out what we are left over with to deal with. What is the excess to the way that Žižek is asking questions, for example? That he may not actually be able to account for the revolution because it is not a formula that he can offer. That maybe engaging with some political action is actually at the very excess of what one can theorize. That philosophy, for example, ends up just footing around without really going anywhere. So it is in this context that I want to return to our given discussion, because we find a similar problem with that this role of seductive figures, or this sort of erotic relationship between the analysand and the analyst, develops. And I want to turn to a particular issue that happened by way of Carl Jung, who represents a general resistance to the notion of sexuality in psychoanalysis, which I discussed briefly as this sort of relationship in which one is opened up to the other, and one works oneself through the other in constituting oneself, as well as accesses to that relationship between identity and difference. So, one of the funniest bits in the history of psychoanalysis stems from a comment that Carl G. Jung said pertaining the interpretation of dreams. According to Jung, proper method and technique would focus on the dream itself rather than getting hung up over any excess or surpluses that arise during free association of the analysand self-narrative. His opposition to Freud amounts to a simple cutting the bullshit. What I like about Lacan is that he talks about the bullshit people try to suppress in our highly sophisticated sewer systems. In one of his lectures in the collection My Teaching, he actually talks in large about sewer systems and how crucial it is to a civilization to have a sewer system. That we need to dispose of these excesses. That's what makes a civilization. Civilization can only happen on that condition. So here we need to suppose that bullshit means sexuality. Jung, for one, resisted the Freudian emphasis on sexuality, and Lacan mentions other analysts who resist to give an importance to sexuality, or at most, make it of secondary importance, or rather, a surplus concern. What Lacan nevertheless asserts is that psychoanalytic truth pertains to sexual life, or this excess or surplus, or again, the bullshit. Once sexuality took the function of truth, and I'm quoting here, it kept it, and sexuality makes a hole in truth. Sexuality is precisely the domain where no one knows what to do about what is true. It takes the form of what we call an act. When we are in the act, when we only stumble in our words to talk around it, we ask ourselves, how are we positioned in relationship to it? As Lacan says of the sexual relationship, we may wonder if I'm really a man and you're really a woman. It not only matters to you and me, but everyone. But we should not take this as some transphobic comment that remains within the normative logic of gender, as some sort of deadlock. Because this would fall into the lure of misrecognition in a subtlety in Lacan. What Lacan questions here is how we position ourselves in relationship to the desire of the other as we are caught in the act, in the register of enjoyment, besides any fiction and meaning we may use to apprehend it. Or as Lacan puts it, a hole in truth is the negative aspect that appears in anything to do with the sexual, namely its inability to aver. Thus, the function of truth in psychoanalysis pertains to sexual relationship, or eros, in the dynamics of the transference, or that the only way to best express it is in the speculative proposition such as there is no sexual relationship. So, The psychoanalytic approach to truth, then, is not what Jung or other analysts propose when they reject sexuality as truth. It is only conceivable in the unspeakable, impossible act of the sexual relationship. If we return to the analysis of dreams, the importance of free association is not that it pertains to the dream itself, but what it thinks and talks around the dream turns out to be the dream itself that we should interpret as analysts. As Lacan puts it, Freud describes the dream as a knot, an associative network of analyzed verbal forms that intersect as such, thanks to the form of homonymy. It is when you have found that thing that concentrates around it, the greatest number of threads in the mycelium, that you know it is the hidden center of gravity of the desire in question, the nodal point where discourse forms a whole. In other words, this is how Lacan arrives at truth. Lacan's approach to truth through psychoanalysis requires a performance of exercises and practices that set up the faculties of the imaginary into tensions and torsions and ruptures in order to have an encounter with it, whatever it is. And it will take a masquerade of its to figure out what it is. And any encountering whatsoever depends on love, the sexual relationship, and eros. In order for one to encounter it, one must be in the confusing and puzzling act in which our blind spots structure the image of our experience. Yet, any access to reality, qua the truth event, ultimately entails a heedful relationship and attentiveness towards the other. This otherness, whether it be symbolic, imaginary, or real, absolutely and indifferently real. One cannot abandon fiction and self-narrative without abandoning the moment of truth. And while myth can obscure and further feed discourses of mastery, knowledge, and hysteria, as in the case of propaganda and ideologues, myth is nevertheless the means of access and the condition of the possibility of truth. An analyst is like a good dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons, or an articulate poet, or an interjectional narrator. An analyst needs to know how to tell a good damn story and be a skillful means magician that prepares us for the moment of truth. Thus, the question of truth in the psychoanalytic experience pertains how one navigates narrative and myth, and perhaps that out of the question of navigating myth, we may work through the character of politics that is faithful to truth. We start asking the question, how can one think truth in the face of ideology, when ideology turns out to just play the role of the myth? So with that respect, I'm gonna leave it here. By now, I have finished the general script of what I wanted to explore with Lacan, but I think I'm gonna be adding a few more things to elaborate on other specific aspects of Lacan that I kind of went over briefly. I have mentioned things like metonymy and metaphor, which I've only talked about in passing, and I think I could do a little bit more of work on it. And also the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, which tend to be the main things that people know when they talk about Lacan, aside from the unconscious structure, like a language. So next, I'm gonna be looking at doing a basic summary of Lacan's three registers, starting with phenomenological terms, because I find that earlier Lacan, in the earlier seminars, had more of a touch with phenomenology before setting up a discourse that would be very much working against it. So I'll use phenomenological terms, but only insofar as it is reaching something that exceeds phenomenology. So next time we're going to be looking at these three registers, and also in passing we're going to learn a little bit about Lacanian mathemes, particularly that of the structure of metaphor and schema L.